Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. Today we've got something really intriguing to delve into. It's about these fascinating and maybe even a little bit surprising connections between the book of Daniel and the book of Revelation in the Bible. Specifically, we're going to be looking at this imagery of beasts and horns and a deadly wound that somehow gets healed.
Yeah, this is some pretty intense stuff.
It is, and you know what makes this even more interesting? The source you've brought us today is actually a transcript of a YouTube analysis by Pastor Esteban Bohr. And from what I've seen, it's pretty detailed.
It is, yeah. It lays out a very specific perspective, drawing parallels between Daniel chapter 7 and Revelation chapter 13, focusing especially on this beast described as having 7 heads and 10 horns.
Right, lots of vivid imagery there. But, before we get too deep into the specifics, let's be upfront about something. We're not here to say this is the one and only correct interpretation.
It's exactly. Our goal today is to really understand the interpretation that's presented in this particular analysis. We want to get into the speaker's head, see how he connects these dots, and what significance he gives to the sequence of kingdoms, this deadly wound, and its potential healing.
Exactly. It's about understanding a particular viewpoint on these incredibly complex texts. So with that said, let's jump right into it. Right from the start, the speaker draws a direct line between Daniel's vision of these 4 separate beasts and then that composite beast that we see in Revelation 13.1:10. So what stands out to you in that initial connection?
Well, I think the most striking thing is how he maps the imagery. He really emphasizes those shared symbols. You've got the lion, the bear, the leopard, and then finally this really powerful dragon with 10 horns showing up in both books. I mean, that's a pretty hard similarity to ignore. And then he goes on to ask this really pointed question. Is Revelation 13 an expansion of Daniel 7? And his answer? A resounding yes. He basically sets the stage for his whole argument by saying the Revelation is building on what was already prophesied in Daniel.
Okay, so he's establishing a foundation there.
Yeah.
And then in Revelation 13, he talks about this sequence of power, how it gets transferred. Can you expand on that a bit?
Absolutely. The speaker points out that it's the dragon with the 10 horns in Revelation 13 who actually gives its authority, its throne, and its immense power to the beast that rises from the sea. This establishes a very clear line of authority, at least in his interpretation.
Okay, so there's a kind of hierarchy being set up there. Now, he goes on to interpret the 4th beast in Daniel, breaking it down into 4 different stages, and then he directly links those stages to what the dragon is doing in Revelation 13. Can you walk us through those 4 stages as he sees them?
He lists them as, first, the dragon trying to kill Jesus; second, the dragon dividing into 10 kingdoms; third, the rise of papal Rome, which he says lasts for 1,260 years. And then finally, the revival of papal Rome after receiving this deadly wound. So you can see he's already laying out a very specific historical and prophetic framework.
And central to this whole interpretation is the speaker's claim that the little horn, mentioned in Daniel 7, and the beast we see in Revelation 13, actually represent the same power. Why does he make that connection?
Well, the key here is that he views them as different symbols, but pointing to the same entity within this whole grand scheme of history and prophecy. And he backs this up by highlighting how both the little horn and the beast are described as doing similar things, speaking arrogantly, blaspheming, holding power for a specific time, and even making war on the faithful. To him, these parallels in their actions strongly indicate that they are different representations of the same power.
It's interesting how he weaves those different threads together. Now, another thing he addresses is the seemingly different time frames given. In Revelation 13, it talks about 42 months, while Daniel 7 mentions 1,260 years. How does he reconcile those?
He does that by explaining that a prophetic month is often interpreted as being 30 days long. So if you take 42 months and multiply that by 30 days, you get 1,260 days. And in a lot of prophetic interpretations, a day is symbolic of a year. Therefore, he equates those 1,260 days to 1,260 years, aligning the time frames.
Okay, so now everything is syncing up within his timeline. And this brings us to this whole concept of the deadly wound, which really grabs your attention. He shifts his focus to those last 2 stages, the 1,260-year rule, the infliction of the wound, and then the healing that follows. What are some of the big questions that he raises about this deadly wound?
Oh, he gets very specific, almost like a detective. He asks things like, what weapon was used to kill the saints? How did the beast obtain this weapon? What weapon wounded the beast? What does this sword actually represent? What is the nature of the wound? Was it healed in 1801 or 1929? What's preventing it from being fully healed today? And ultimately, when, how, and by whom will it be completely healed? It's a very systematic approach to understanding this mystery.
And that's really what we're trying to do here, unravel this mystery. And his starting point is this dual meaning that he assigns to the word sword as it appears in the Bible. Can you break down those two meanings for us?
Sure. He basically says the sword has two primary symbolic meanings in the Bible. The first one comes from Ephesians 6:7-10, which talks about the sword of the Spirit, which is God's word, given to believers for spreading the gospel. But then he brings in Romans 13:1-4, which talks about the government having a sword, which he interprets as the power to enforce laws and punish those who break them, so the power of the state. And understanding this distinction is really crucial to following his argument.
It definitely sounds like a key element in this interpretation. So, using this distinction, why does he argue that the sword used by the beast to kill and the one that wounded it can't be the word of God?
His reasoning is that the papacy, which he identifies as the beast in this scenario, didn't primarily use the Bible to literally kill people during that 1260-year period he's talking about. And on the flip side, the Bible itself didn't physically wound the papacy in the way described. Therefore, he concludes that the sword in this specific prophetic context must be something different than the Word of God.
So he's ruling out the sword of the Spirit. So what does he point to instead?
Well, he connects it directly to the power of the state. He sees it as the authority of governments to punish people for breaking civil laws. He's making a clear distinction between the church's spiritual authority and the power of secular rulers to enforce laws. And this distinction also seems to imply that he sees a separation between church and state in this whole symbolic language.
Okay, so we're building this layer upon layer of interpretation. And with that understanding of the sword, he then goes on to connect it to the actual deadly wound itself. And he specifically references Revelation 13:10 and 14. What's the key message he pulls from those verses in this context?
Well, those verses talk about believers being taken captive and killed by the sword, and then they go on to say that the beast itself receives a wound by the sword. And then he links that to something Jesus said in Matthew 26:5-2. Jesus tells Peter to put away his sword, and says that all who live by the sword will die by the sword.
It's fascinating how he's bringing in different parts of the Bible to build this argument. So how does he weave all of these verses together to explain the deadly wound that's inflicted on the beast?
His interpretation is that the same kind of sword, that power of civil authority that the beast used throughout history to persecute others, ultimately gets turned against it and causes its own downfall, its deadly wound. Basically, he argues that the powers that be withdrew their support and their sword from the papacy.
It's almost like a poetic justice kind of thing, but he's also very careful to explain what he believes the deadly wound is not about. What distinctions does he make?
He emphasizes that, to him, the deadly wound doesn't mean that the papacy lost all its physical territories, or that the Catholic Church as an institution completely ceased to exist. The Church continued its spiritual work. The crucial point of the wound, he says, is the loss of that coercive law-enforcing power, that sword, which he believes the papacy wielded for 1,260 years against those who opposed it.
So the heart of the wound, in his interpretation, is that stripping away of civil enforcement power from the church. And this naturally leads to the question of how the beast got that power in the first place. What period in history does he zero in on for that?
He takes us back to the time of the barbarian invasions of the Roman Empire, roughly between 300 and 476 AD. He talks about how the Western Roman Empire started to break apart, culminating in the last Western Roman emperor being deposed in 476.
And paint a picture for us. What was the situation like in the former Roman Empire after that happened, according to him?
He paints a pretty chaotic picture, basically a complete breakdown of central authority. The once mighty empire had crumbled, leaving a huge void in terms of law and order. And this is where his interpretation gets really interesting. He proposes that the various barbarian tribes actually turned to the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, and asked him to step in and help establish some stability and order in this chaotic time.
That's quite a claim. And he brings in quotes from Cardinal Henry Edward Manning to support this. What are the key points he pulls from those quotes?
Well, according to the speaker, Manning argued that after the empire fell apart, the popes basically became the main source of order, peace, law, and security in the region. He even goes so far as to say that removing the emperor essentially freed up the successor of Peter, the Pope, to rule in Rome. It's presented as this pivotal turning point in the rise of the papacy's temporal power.
It's almost like a transfer of power from the emperor to the pope in this interpretation. And he goes on to connect this historical perspective to a passage in 2 Thessalonians 2, which talks about a restraining power being removed before the man of sin is revealed. How does he link those two ideas together?
Well, he interprets the barbarian invasions and the fall of the Western Roman Empire as being that removal of the restraining power. This, he argues, allowed the man of sin, which he equates with the papacy gaining civil authority, to fully emerge on the scene.
So he sees those historical events as setting the stage for this prophetic figure to rise. Manning is further quoted as saying that the papacy was just waiting for the right moment for God to free it from being subject to civil powers so it could claim its own sovereignty. What's the speaker's take on that? Does he agree with that divine attribution?
Well, that's where it gets a little subtle. While Manning frames this shift as God's will, the speaker seems to suggest that it was more of a natural consequence of history, that the papacy simply stepped into the power vacuum left by the crumbling empire. He focuses more on the historical narrative than on endorsing the theological explanation.
So he's maybe suggesting there's more than one way to look at that transition. He then circles back to Revelation 13.7, which mentions going into captivity, and connects it to Revelation 20, which talks about the binding of Satan. What parallel does he draw there?
He suggests that the Pope, being in captivity under the Roman Emperor, actually meant that the Pope was bound from exercising civil authority. So the removal of the Emperor was like freeing the Pope to wield that power, and therefore he sees the deadly wound as representing those civil powers taking back their support, and the healing being when they give their support back.
It's like a back-and-forth struggle for power between these entities. And it's important to remember that there are definitely other interpretations of this historical and theological period out there. In fact, he goes on to present quotes from Catholic writers talking about the papacy's temporal power during those 1260 years. What perspectives do they offer?
The Catholic writers, he quotes, generally agree that the papacy did wield significant temporal power, especially during the Middle Ages. They talk about how Rome, after its emperors became weak, turned to the Pope for leadership and governance. And they outline a progression where the Church essentially became dominant in secular affairs after the empire crumbled. One quote even claims that the papacy's power, both spiritual and temporal, actually exceeded that of the Roman emperor during the Middle Ages.
It's really interesting to see those different perspectives, and one quote that really stands out is that the Church, during the Middle Ages, was basically the state, with civil authority as its police department.
Yeah, that one really paints a vivid picture of how closely intertwined religious and civil power were during that period.
It certainly does. And then he brings in Pope Boniface VIII's 1302 bull Unam Sanctam and its two swords theology. Can you give us a quick rundown of that doctrine?
In a nutshell, Unam Sanctam declared that the Church had authority over both spiritual and temporal matters, symbolized by two swords. The Church would wield the spiritual sword, while kings and soldiers would use the temporal sword, but only under the Church's direction and approval. So it really solidified this idea of the Church's supremacy over the state during that time.
It's almost like a blueprint for how they saw that power dynamic. So having established that historical context of the papacy wielding significant temporal power, he then shifts to this crucial year, 1798, and the infliction of the deadly wound. Take us there. What happened in 1798?
Well, he paints a very dramatic scene. It's the height of the French Revolution, and General Berthier of Napoleon's army marches right into Rome, captures Pope Pius VI, and strips him of all his papal symbols of power. The Pope is then exiled to France, where he dies the next year.
It's a pretty powerful image. And to emphasize the impact of this event, he brings in a number of historical accounts. What are some of the key interpretations that those sources offer?
Several accounts describe the papacy as being basically wiped out in 1798, at least in terms of its worldly power. Some go as far as to say that no trace of its former authority remained. It's pointed out that none of the Catholic powers in Europe came to the Pope's defense, which shows a real shift in their relationship with the papacy. One account even states that Rome was left without a prince or a pontiff, and there was a decree that no successor should be elected. It almost seemed like the papacy was finished. Others believe that this was a sign that the whole papal dynasty was about to collapse. One source even calls it the papacy's most humiliating moment, a wound that seemed incurable until much later.
It really seemed like a definitive moment in history, and he points out the irony that France, which had initially played a role in helping to establish the papacy's civil authority centuries earlier, was now the nation that brought it crashing down.
Talk about a historical turnaround. And he really emphasizes that, to him, the deadly wound was specifically about the removal of the papacy's civil power, not the end of the Catholic Church itself, or the taking of its territories at that particular moment.
Okay, so now we come to the question of this wound being healed. And he examines two possible periods for this, 1801 and 1929. So let's start with 1801. What happened that year?
In 1801, Napoleon allowed a new pope to be elected, and the speaker brings in a historian, Arthur Robert Pennington, who suggests that Napoleon's motives were basically political. The vast majority of French people were Catholic, so Napoleon saw a strategic advantage in making peace with the church and reestablishing it in France. So they signed this agreement called the Concordat of 1801, which did just that. It brought the Catholic Church back into the fold in France, and it also allowed Pope Pius VII to keep some control over the Papal States.
So it seems like at least a partial restoration of power there. But why doesn't the speaker see this as the complete healing of the deadly wound described in Revelation?
He lays out a few reasons. First, he points to the fact that Revelation 13 suggests the United States, not France, will play the key role in the healing. Second, he says that even in 1801, the papacy still didn't have widespread support from the major European powers. Then he brings up the fact that the prophetic signs linked to the healed wound, like the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, didn't actually happen after 1801. And finally, he notes that even under the Concordat, the papacy's power was still very much limited by the French state.
So he sees 1801 as maybe a step towards healing, but not the full picture. Then he moves on to the events of 1870 as another potential wound. What happened then?
On September 20, 1870, the armies of King Victor Emmanuel II of Italy captured Rome, and they ended up annexing the Papal States. This is basically what led to the unification of Italy as we know it today. But this move really angered the Vatican, so much so that the next three, Popes Pius IX, Leo III, and Pius II, all refused to leave the Vatican for the next 59 years as a form of protest.
Wow, that's a long time. And speaking of Pope Pius IX, the speaker mentions some things he did during his time that really strained relations between the papacy and other nations. What were some of those actions?
Well, under Pope Pius IX, you had the declaration of the Dogma of the Immaculate Conception in 1854. But even more significant was his issuing of the Syllabus of Errors in 1864. This document basically condemned a lot of modern ideas, like democratic governments and freedom of conscience, which caused a lot of tension with many European countries and the United States. And then later on, the Declaration of Papal Infallibility only added fuel to the fire.
It sounds like a very turbulent time. So now let's get to this idea that the wound was healed in 1929. Where did this belief come from, especially within the Adventist Church?
This belief seems to have sprung from a headline in the San Francisco Chronicle on February 11, 1929. It read, "Vatican again in peace with Italy after long feud," and the subheading was, "Heals wound of many years." That caught people's attention.
But the speaker points out a crucial detail about which wound that article was actually referring to. What was it really talking about?
The article was specifically talking about the resolution of the Roman question, that ongoing dispute that stemmed from the 1870 annexation of the Papal States. It wasn't talking about the 1798 wound inflicted by the French Revolution. The New York Times also covered the event, and they emphasized that the Pope was now an independent sovereign ruler again, though only of the tiny Vatican City. So it was all about settling the issues that arose after 1870.
So it's a matter of being very precise about which wound we're talking about. And the speaker gives a number of reasons why he doesn't see 1929 as the complete fulfillment of the healing prophesied in Revelation. What are his main arguments against it?
Well, first off, he points out that the San Francisco Chronicle article itself is clearly talking about the 1870 situation. Then he brings up his interpretation that the United States, not Italy, is supposed to play the key role in healing the 1798 wound. He also notes that the things Revelation 13 says will happen when the wound is healed, like the world marveling after the beast, the making of an image, and the enforcing of a mark, didn't happen after 1929. So while 1929 might have been a step toward restoring the papacy's civil standing, he argues that it wasn't the full prophetic healing described in Revelation.
It seems like he's looking for something much bigger and more dramatic than what happened in 1929. So where does this leave us with the current state of the wound? He introduces a quote from a Jesuit priest named Malachi Martin. Who was he, and what was his perspective on all of this?
Malachi Martin was a pretty well-known figure, a Jesuit priest, who wrote quite a bit about the inner workings of the Catholic Church. In 1986, he observed that for about 1,500 years, the papacy had held a lot of sway around the world. But then, he believed that the major secular powers of the world had essentially forced the papacy into about 200 years of inactivity.
And how does the speaker connect Martin's time frame to this whole idea of the 1798 deadly wound?
Well, if you count back about 200 years from 1986 when Martin made that statement, you land pretty squarely on the French Revolution in 1798. That same year, the speaker pinpoints as the moment the papacy lost its direct civil authority. And the speaker emphasizes that Martin believed secular governments had basically prevented the papacy from regaining its former dominance.
So even though the wound might be healing in some ways, it's still an open question in his view. Well, this has been a really deep dive into some complex stuff. Let's try to wrap up with some key takeaways.
Absolutely. I think at its core, we've explored a very specific interpretation that links the symbolic language of Daniel 7 and Revelation 13, particularly when it comes to these images of beasts and horns. We followed the argument that the sword represents civil power, how the papacy supposedly gained that power and then lost it in 1798, the deadly wound. And then we looked at why the speaker doesn't see either 1801 or 1929 as fulfilling the prophecy of the wound's complete healing.
And now it's time for that final thought, something to leave you, our listener, pondering. Taking this interpretation, that the deadly wound is about the loss of direct civil power and the healing signifies its restoration. What events are happening in our world today that might fit into that framework? What subtle or not so subtle shifts are you seeing in the relationship between religious institutions and government power that could be pointing towards this healing? It's a really fascinating question to consider as you continue your own exploration of these important and timeless topics. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.